The new law of evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right or you get eliminated. In the last 7 deals that I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion. Thank you. I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
Fly me to the moon. Let me play among the stars.
Thank you.
Okay, so after a kind of weird startup that was kind of an anti-startup, I finally got everything up. So, this is going to be the final lecture that I'm going to give, the valedictory lecture. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't kind of do a summation here of everything that we've gone over and the ways in which it kind of leads up to the Adam Curtis documentary. And I feel that the Adam Curtis documentary, although I'm not going to concentrate on episode 4, I'm going to concentrate on episode 3, because I honestly believe that the first 3 episodes kind of are the meat of his thesis. You know, he's attempting to make, a very, very sophisticated argument about the history of the 20th century and the ways in which capital and business and government ensued this tug of war match between each other to basically come up with different forms of social engineering and ways of financializing American life that one could, certainly argue has led to the conditions in which we are currently living in. Certainly one can talk about this history of economic crises as being a prelude to what we're facing now. And I do believe that some of the history that we've investigated and some of the ideas that we've investigated in the class, starting straight from Berger, will equip you with a toolbox to understand and possibly speculate on the way things are going to go due to the financial instability that we are currently facing. I think that, to quote George Santayana, the great philosopher, history has a tendency to repeat itself. Not necessarily, I look at history being more of a kind of upward spiral than, just a kind of merry-go-round going around and around. And I think that, no one can really predict, what this is going to look like. Although, I think that we're equipped with tools now to understand the ways in which, the corporate state has operated in the past, and we could certainly make some learned and educated speculations as to the way things will go in relation to the pandemic. Having the media literacy, having the level of media literacy to be able to sift through, blatant propaganda and blatant attempts at, for instance, unrolling the economy prematurely, in direct confrontation with some of the warnings of the epidemiological community. The best I can offer is to stay educated and not buy into everything that gets, said, from either the Oval Office or from the mainstream media. But that now, you've got the tools. Go and do good works, my sons and daughters, out in the world. That isn't necessarily going to come to an end anytime soon. Just want to reiterate some of the final bullet points here regarding final projects. Final projects are going to be on Tuesday over the weekend. It is currently Friday night. Over the weekend, I will have a link up on Blackboard, and we'll email you as soon as that link is up as to where to upload your final papers and or projects. Okay. The other thing that I want to put out there that I'm not going to encourage, only because I'm lazy, is the idea of if you want to. I know at least one person turned a paper in to me today and asked for my feedback. And I kind of looked at it and shot it back to him with some comments and ideas. So, if you want to throw me a Hail Mary pass at the last minute over the weekend, shoot me a project, could this be better? It's like, I'm going to say yes, although, I want to try to work as little as possible this weekend. I want to try to I want to be the first man in history to just not burn a single calorie over a 48-hour period. It's a goal of mine. It's always been a dream. I don't know if I can accomplish it, but and I still have a lecture to do for mass media research, so that's probably not going to happen. But once again, if you want to hand in projects early and just kind of ping me over the weekend to kind of look at it, to give you a little critique, I'll do it. But not too many, folks. Not too many. So want to get back and finish up. I feel a kind of duty to kind of wrap up and unpack the rest of Century of the Self due to the fact that I think it's an exceedingly important documentary and a series, and I think it goes into some very, very important territory that has a great bearing on learning your history and becoming and being able to, rethink, what the future is going to look like by kind of knowing their game, and being able to respond to it accordingly. Because I'm not necessarily optimistic or pessimistic about the near future. I'm kind of ambivalent, in my educated opinion, certain sectors of society within the next 2 or 3 years are probably not going to be good. But I think that certain things can be averted. I also think that this given situation may actually spell some kind of paradigmatic breaking point with the past in terms of how we operate, not only as a nation but as a species. Because the clock is ticking, and we know it. We know that the clock is ticking, and it's not unsalvageable. It's not necessarily unsalvageable. Curtis starts the beginning, so we kind of ended up with this overview of episode 2, Engineering of Consent, and the ways in which the psychoanalytical community and Edward Bernays and Anna Freud, in their respective positions, attempted to kind of use psychoanalytic tools to shape mass behavior, primarily to shape mass behavior towards not necessarily democratic or values of liberation and equality as much as shifting it towards a kind of financialization of the human being and kind of playing to the interest of what would become more and more of an entangled corporate state, and that I believe that episode 3 talks about different strategies and attempts by different groups, especially the youth movement in this country during the 60s, to kind of mount attempts at a resistance toward this. That, throughout the 60s, the children of baby boomers who had been prosperous, we saw more and more people going to college. We saw more and more people, we saw a greater sector of the American population of youth going to universities and colleges and becoming college educated and learning about what had gone before. And I think that the prosperity of the 50s and in a strange way, the prosperity and all that suburban white picket fence, cookie cutter affluence would lead to a generation of alienated youth that were becoming college educated that would ultimately question the wisdom of their parents and the older generations, and there would be the shift, and there would be these attempts at resistance, and the time was very, very ripe for it. Remember, the time was very, very ripe for kind of organized resistance due to the fact that there were 3 primary areas of social and political life that were very, very fertile ground for resistance. The first being the anti-war movement, the eventual escalation of a war in Southeast Asia that people didn't really understand why we were there. It was a war. It was one of the first of our wars that was not really justifiable in the ways that prior wars had been justifiable. One could argue that the Korean War was somewhat frivolous, to the degree of what its aims and goals were, but it didn't. And it's like we were talking about with Sontag. There wasn't the foundation for a resistance to that war as much as there was for the war in Indochina and the war in Vietnam. And I think a lot of that also is connected to the ways in which the media would be able to gain mass media, whether it be the major networks or journalists, were able to gain, to become embedded in that war, to get access to that war, and through, the miracle of satellite television and mass communications, actually communicate that war to the American population with images. I think a lot of it had to do with mass media technology, as well as other, conditions that seemed right. The other piece of it would be like the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and after their assassinations, certainly the African American and black communities in this country were very, 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 very ripe to continue the seeds of what the civil rights movement had laid, with certain groups like the Black Panthers and all of that. And the third piece, the third leg of the tripod would be the feminist movement. The feminist movement, the women's rights movements that would come, and they would all kind of be united in this kind of common purpose. But underlying it all, and what Curtis will show, and at this point in the documentary, is a generation that will really start to question the consumer values and capitalist values of their parents' generation. He will also talk quite tragically about the ways in which that initial movement would ultimately kind of fall apart by the early 70s, and how corporate America would find a way of rechanneling all that revolutionary energy into with a very, very baroque and sophisticated form of advertising and social engineering, would take all those movements and kind of shift them towards a place of which would ultimately culminate in the me generation, and the generation that would come up in the 80s. The generation slightly older than my generation. I would consider myself like Generation X. I kind of come up, I'm like I think I'm about 15, 16 years old when Reagan gets elected. And the generation before that is kind of called the me decade. The me decade, meaning that it was a decade that had been sold on this model of the human being that was based on self-actualization being about how you expressed yourself, but not how you expressed yourself intellectually or culturally or spiritually, as much as how you expressed yourself through your consumption. This idea of self-expression through consumption that we had already seen Bernays play with during the 20s and 30s, but it would become much more sophisticated by the 70s. And, in relation to all these different movements, there would also be this kind of resistance and blowback within the psychoanalytical community itself. There would be these kind of factions who would break off from this kind of normative approach to psychoanalysis as a therapy, and feel that some of the underpinning beliefs of this idea of like controlling the self, of repressing one's emotions, of balancing one's emotions was actually running counter to what was therapeutic, and a whole new generation of psychoanalysis would question everything that had come before, and would actually think in a very inverted kind of way about things. In terms, the whole idea would like rest on this total kind of flip on like what a person should be doing with their emotions, and this school, these different, numerous schools of psychoanalysis and therapy will spring up that will feel that the emotions and all those drives and all those instincts that had formerly been that we had been told to repress. And, there was always, the whole idea of, like, for instance, in Hollywood, the whole idea of, like, actors like Gary Cooper and all of, like, the role models of Hollywood, like, were predicated on the idea of the, like, strong, silent type. And there was this toxic masculinity. I mean, the term wasn't even in use then, but there was this toxic masculinity that pervaded 50s America that became contested, on a lot of different fronts, on a lot of different cultural fronts. And psychoanalysis would resist by coming up with a model of therapy in which you, instead of bottling up all of this stuff and internalizing all this stuff, that the real key was to the real key would be the exact opposite, which would be to express your emotions, to get them out, to express whatever kind of negative feelings that you were carrying around with you within some kind of controlled setting, in order to kind of expiate that, to have what in psychoanalytical terms is called an abreaction, of just getting, for all intents and purposes, like attempting to, like, get rid of it by getting it out of your system, and in controlled environments, like kind of acting out, expressing your rage, expressing your grief. And there would be a lot of quackery that would come up around this stuff too. The 70s became a time very ripe for these kind of self-actualization communities that we'll talk about, like Est and Esalen and Scientology, and other ones that Curtis won't even talk about. But first comes the blowback. First comes, and Curtis will say right at the beginning of episode 3, that this whole movement towards self-awareness and self-actualization would be revolutionary to a degree, but Curtis will warn us basically at the very beginning of the program of episode 3 that what in fact emerged from this revolution was the very opposite of what it attempted to achieve. The anti-war movement and hippie culture and the feminist movement and all these different alliances that were made, to fight, the corporate state, to fight the war in Vietnam, to fight all this oppression, would ultimately, Curtis will contend, turn into its very opposite by the time of the early 70s. And he'll say, but what in fact emerged from this revolution was the very opposite. An isolated, vulnerable, and above all, greedy self. We end up with like Gordon Gekko says in Wall Street, we end up in a place in American culture where greed becomes a kind of value that people are no longer ashamed of, because it's been kind of embroidered into this idea of, what your God-given liberties are, that you have this liberty to, you not only have like liberty for life, it's not only just liberty for the pursuit of happiness, but liberty for the pursuit of money and products and stuff, that became the synonym for, this self-expression. And so he says, an isolated, vulnerable, and above all, greedy self, far more open to manipulation by both business and politics than anything which had come before it. All right? It gets more sophisticated at this point. Those in power would now control the self, not by repressing it, not by repressing the self and controlling one's emotions and thoughts, but by feeding it's infinite desires. It's infinite desires, and if we had the time, we could talk about how that modality of never enough, that modality of always, needing the next thing, needing the next car, needing the next, G8 phone, whatever, needing the next pair of sneakers, that, have become fashionable, is also in a lot of ways, like this kind of psychological modality of never enough will play into the fact that Americans would become the biggest consumers of illicit drugs in the world, that we would consume a far, far greater percentage of illicit drugs than any other culture. I would certainly make a cogent case that would come from this kind of existential vacuum that was created within people, in which nothing was ever enough. Once again, we're like kind of chasing, we're back on a treadmill. And a lot of this would ultimately fall into the political climate of the American With all this being said, the American population would be ripe for a president, and in the UK also, and most of Western Europe would be pretty much ripe for a political hegemony that would kind of socially engineer people to in favor of shifting values towards those of affluence, those of like climbing the social and economic ladder. And both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher would start to construct this ideology, equating business and equating the accumulation of capital and stuff with, your God-given right, the zenith of becoming, the zenith of success. It's like financial and social success would be synonymous with success as such, not necessarily success as a moral, ethical, educated, grounded, socially aware human being, as much as a human being who had arrived at the American dream through what he had, what he owned, and what his bank statements looked like, and what his stock portfolio looked like. And I lived through that. I lived through that period. One of the main points of resistance to Anna Freud's monopoly on the psychoanalytical community would be a guy by the name of Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich, who was initially a Freudian, who was initially a student of Freud, and would ultimately break from Freud's thinking about repression and the libido, and his work would ultimately look at the solution to human unhappiness as being one in which the libido should be unleashed, and that all this repression has been the cause of all this misfortune. And he's a very, very controversial figure in this whole narrative, due to the fact that when Reich initially comes onto the scene, he writes a book. He's very much the academic very early on. Not that he's not controversial, but he'll write a book that will be a very seminal book, and a book that I would strongly suggest you read, called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. It was considered like Reich's classic book, trying to get to the core of like why the primary question that the book poses is that of, you know, given the choice that human beings have, and he'll pose it in a kind of rhetorical way. He'll pose this question: given the choice between freedom and slavery, what was it about human character that, given the choice, historically always seemed to opt for some variation on enslavement? And he wanted to answer that question. And he would start unpacking it along with another great thinker of the time who was a Freudian of a certain type by the name of Herbert Marcuse, who will address it along an entirely different trajectory, but not totally. They won't totally be unlike each other, you know. But you know, Herbert Marcuse will pose the same kind of questions about you know why it had come to this, and try to analyze the situation. The problem with Reich, so him and Anna Freud will lock horns, and we find out that in 1956, in 1934, he is basically ejected from the psychoanalytical community as a renegade. He leaves. He comes to America, and some of his ideas before, and he'll start to let's call it what it is. He starts to just go fucking bonkers. You know, near the end of his life, he starts coming up with all this kind of weird pseudoscience about orgone energy, but you know, the main corpus of his work had to do with the idea of that repression, that man wasn't able to unleash his libido, it's like, once again, we're back to like the sexual instincts, and Reich was a believer in the idea of, and a lot of people will talk about his like that the human need for an orgasm. He was like, you know, humans don't have enough orgasms. They don't have enough sexual orgasms, or they're repressed in one way or another. And that if we lived in a culture that was more erotic, that allowed more for sexual expression of these libidinous forces, that we would be better adjusted, you know. And that kind of thinking really would kind of lead to, you know, all kinds of different ideas, like communal ideas of the hippie culture and free love, and it's all kind of a piece, you know. But he would ultimately get just a little nutty, you know, later on. And those of you who have watched the documentary will see that he starts to get into. I'll talk about it in a minute. So there's this confrontation between Reich and Anna Freud, and you know, and Curtis makes the case for, ultimately it seemed as if, you know, psychoanalysis fell into like disrepute, and Reich was kind of like ostracized and marginalized to the point where he would just go bonkers and ultimately end up in prison. And in Leesville prison, he'll die the next year. They get him for fraud. He starts building all these different devices to harness all of this supposed libidinous energy he says occurs in the atmosphere. And he comes up with a gun. He comes up with this gun called the Orgon accumulator, this weird gun in his backyard that's supposedly like pulling this like vital etheric energy, this mystical energy out of the atmosphere. And he also said that it was good at like combating UFOs. Yeah, so there was that. there was also like a box that he was like Mark. He was like kind of a Mark. He just really kind of went nuts and started marketing this box that people could sit in, that would supposedly, kind of like, and not unlike some of the quackery of Scientology with their e-meters and all that stuff. All these kind of pseudo-scientific self-actualization movements kind of come up at the same time. With the disclaimer of the fact that, if you read some of Reich's early work, it's very sound. He talks a lot about this idea of how we carry around what he calls characterological armor, how we're kind of armored in our kind of self-defense. And his form of therapy was always about kind of dismantling that armor, for you to kind of free yourself of this, kind of constant defensive posturing. He literally would say it would just have all these kind of psychosomatic consequences of being kind of retentive and defensive, that were, his early ideas are pretty viable, But, so all of this will ensue, all right? And what we'll ultimately see happen is this whole idea of the libido, this whole idea of this kind of vital life force / sexual energy / this kind of, we got to remember that, in Freud's conception of what the libido is, it's not all, and certainly later on, psychoanalysis will widen the horizon to what constitutes, the libido. The libido, one could almost look at the libido kind of like the Force in Star Wars or something, that it was kind of like this vital force that found its most instrumental expression in sexuality, but, what would ultimately happen is that, it's like the corporate world would take a lot of these ideas and repackage the libido into the idea of stuff, the idea of buying stuff, the idea of channeling all that, sexual repression into hence, the idea of sex sells, the idea that consumption would lead to more sex, like in Vance Packard's book, The Hidden Persuaders, he talks about the idea that, married men would make a connection between, older married men would make a connection between buying a convertible and having a mistress. That everything, that consumer objects always kind of had this libidinous, these libidinous potentialities to them, and there's a lot of and certainly that holds a lot of credibility, to the idea that, I think we still live in a culture where money and power and fame are an aphrodisiac for misguided people. It's so this whole idea of taking all these ideas of revolution and freedom and expression of and self-expression and resistance, and channeling it into, corporate ideas, was a gradual shift, This is a picture of Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse was a German philosopher who would write a book that I would strongly suggest people read. I can't remember when it came out, but it was one of his first major works, and it was called One-Dimensional Man. And it was attempting to make this case about the ways in which the corporate state had, been culpable and just turning us into the shadows of a human being. These these kind of, these rule followers that were, you know, administrated. We just became these administrated human beings that didn't know who we were anymore, and we're one-dimensional to a certain degree. And he offers an analysis of how that happened in One-Dimensional Man, and it's a very, very powerful book. And it's a difficult book, but it's not as difficult as a lot of what would come later on with some of the more difficult philosophers like Derrida and Foucault. It's actually, One-Dimensional Man is like, for any relatively intelligent person, it's not tough going. It's not really that tough going. I remember reading it probably in my late 20s. I had read it, and to me it was just like this cold. It was like an epiphany. It was really like an epiphany. I really resonated with Marcuse and my own ideas, and I was like, yeah, it's like he gets it. Marcuse gets like the way I feel about stuff, you know. So I just, you know, I kind of submit it to you that, you know, it's like, if you want to, you know, it's like, I mean, I would submit reading in general to you guys, you know, getting back to this whole idea of like getting back to reading books, you know, important books, you know, books that will help you, you know, in this somewhat, you know, torturous route that we are about to embark on, to keep you, you know, to you know, kind of, you know, let you know what's essential and what's not, and how to overcome, you know, all of this negativity, you know, by, you know, recognizing certain freedoms that you have or may not have, and realizing how they did it, you know. Because once again, I think that, you know, especially in our final lecture, I think it's very important for me to stress to you, you know, as an educator and, you know, as you know, your professor, that, you know, I feel a vocational need to say to you, you know, it's like, you know, I want to say, like, you know, I would stress the idea of your well-being, of your psychic and ongoing health and prosperity, and that, you know, it's like, I think we come back to the idea that it's like you need to be your own solution. You really need to start to become your own solution, no matter what happens. If heaven and earth falls, you know, it's like you still, you know, have this gift of your life and this drama that you can lead out, and still have a meaningful and fulfilling life beyond your wildest dreams, you know, if you work for it. If you work for it, not just like working out there at, you know, Starbucks or wherever, or working for the man in some corporate, you know, prison, but working on yourself, you know, finding time for yourself, especially now more than ever, finding time to cultivate yourself, to find out who you are, you know, and to get, you know, some of the negative influences out of your life, whatever it's like whatever your Achilles heel might be at this point, you know, it's like I always tell students that, you know, the first recipe for any kind of personal or career success has to do with the idea of getting rid of whatever your Achilles heel is, meaning whatever are the things going on in your life that are holding you back from having, you know, a fulfilling life, you know. And it's like, whether it be, you know, addiction to substances of some type or another, or some psychological, you know, snag that you might find yourself in, whatever that is, whatever the blockage is, whether it be on a psychological level or on the level of the level of stress and anxiety, to like really, you know, feel that you're worth it. You're worth. It's like, you know, this is your life, you know, and you're the one, you know, and goddamn anyone that would take it away from you or limit you, you know, or turn you into a sheep, you know. It's like, you know, you're a miracle, you're a miracle. And, my whole philosophy about pedagogy is that whoever is in front of me is already, already a genius of one type or another. It's just getting away taking the blockage away from the person, as opposed to a form of pedagogy where you're a blank slate and I'm putting stuff in. There. We've seen how that goes horribly wrong. We saw in the last lecture the whole idea of the blank slate with Dr. Ewan Cameron, but that it's really that the educational and pedagogical modalities of the future should be more about getting rid of what's limiting you, as opposed to, just taking in information and utilizing it in whatever vocational way you are. And it's like going back to the Matrix. You are the one. And I wanted to do all that with the camera wide, and I didn't. There will be all these, during this period of the anti-war movement and this whole anti-corporate movement, there will be revolutionary groups in this country that you should definitely check out and do some research on. One of the groups would be called the Weathermen. The Weathermen, they would be an underground group, really, that were basically revolutionaries that were bent on, that were not adverse to going. They felt that the Weathermen were of the belief that the American population was literally at war with the corporate state, and that the corporate state should be hit and dismantled by whatever means necessary. Which included the bombing of certain infrastructural things. It's like, don't mistake this, for a endorsement of what they did. All right. They were always very keen on the idea of there's a very, very interesting history on the Weathermen out there, a documentary if you ever want to see it, that they really felt that we were at war, and that we are at war with, a violent, militaristic form of oppression, and that we needed to fight back, that we, up to and including violent opposition. And they wouldn't be the only ones that would feel that way about it. There would be groups like the SDS, the Student Democratic Society, the Black Panthers, that felt that, and we'll see it play back out in some of our anti-authoritarian groups nowadays, like Antifa or the Black Bloc, that these are just the grandchildren of a form of opposition that endorsed violence of one type or another. Although the Weathermen would be very, very, they would be very savvy in the way that they would relate to, their public relations mechanism was always about the idea that they would, they would bomb. I can't remember exactly what they bombed. They bombed a couple of political places and a couple of banks, but they would always make a point of saying that they would call ahead for them to so that the loss of any human life, very few people, if any, ended up dying as a result of the Weathermen's activities. They just caused a lot of havoc. But and Curtis stresses that the credo of this whole general zeitgeist, this whole kind of feeling of opposition towards the U.S. military and the U.S. corporate state and the U.S. government could be summarized in a kind of meme of, there is a policeman in all of our heads, he must be destroyed. What does he mean? What he means is that we kind of, through all this social engineering and manufacturing of consent and propaganda, that ultimately we will have a kind of constructed order follower in our heads, giving us orders and reinforcing what was being told to us from the outside. The idea of a policeman in your head that would be, this kind of reinforcement of the prescriptive, repressive elements of the society, the life script that we would run in ourselves to keep us repressed and to keep us docile and to keep us, under wraps, But ultimately, what would happen with this whole kind of militancy part of it is that, throughout the late '60s, either via the police or the National Guard or the military, there was student protest all over the country, and the blowback from it was very, very violent. It's like, for instance, if you do any research on there was these huge student protests and anti-war protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, in which the mayor at that time, a guy by the name of Richard Daley, was this kind of hawkish, no nonsense, draconian kind of militant who sent out hundreds of armed militarized police to stop, they were literally beating people up. They were literally beating the shit out of protesters, and a lot of people got hurt. And of course, there would later, during that same year, I believe, be the incident at Kent State University in Ohio, where the National Guard just basically in cold blood shot four unarmed students. There was a lot. It's and contrary to what Doug Lane said in our interview with him, at least on this side of the Atlantic, a lot of people got killed. A lot of black militants got killed. A guy by the name of Fred Hampton, who had been one of the heads of the Black Panther organization. Watch a documentary on the Black Panthers and find out how the FBI basically just went and assassinated went to Fred Hampton's home and just killed him. Just went in without a warrant, without any provocation, and just fucking shot him, and for no reason other than the fact of that what he represented, to white America, So there was Fred Hampton, there was Kent State, but the blowback was violent, and finally, these student protests started to. There was this realization, a lot of victories were gained. The anti-war movement in this country literally did slow down the war and change policy, because for a period of time it was just so heated that the president at the time, Nixon, and his Secretary of State, Kissinger, were literally in fear of their life. It's there were these huge protests in Washington, these huge student, the hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of mostly leftist kids, opposing the war and opposing the draft, and they circled the White House and they circled the Pentagon to the point where Nixon would literally build a barricade around the entire block of Pennsylvania Avenue and the White House with school buses end to end, because they were in fear. They were literally in fear of their safety, And there's a well-known incident that has been cited and has been confirmed, that there was a conversation that went on between Kissinger and Nixon in the White House, and Nixon asked Kissinger, he was scared, and he was just like, what if they get through? That they had the opposition, that the resistance movement had created the conditions in which, the ruling class was really kind of fearful. The fearful, and at the very least, back about 10 years ago, I had a talk with a guy by the name of Michael Albert. Michael Albert, who had been a member of the SDS, the Students Democratic for a More Democratic Society, and had been part of this whole scene. And he would ultimately tell me that the effectiveness of the protests had to do with the fact that they made day-to-day, finally, they got some results due to the fact that they made life in Washington, like in the Beltway, like getting around for like congressmen, officials, and lawyers to get around town. They made life like impossible, just to get around. And that they put enough pressure on the powers that be that they got a few bones thrown their way, But ultimately, like many movements of this type do, instead of kind of turning into outright revolution, they run out of steam. Because what we'll find out historically is that by the time of the 60s and 70s, the U.S., the military, the U.S. military, was just so formidable and was so well equipped that, for students to go after them, with like sticks and Molotov cocktails, it was like laughable. There was too many people getting hurt, so that the whole opposition just kind of backed down. And we can see in the documentary, they talk with a couple of people who had been on the forefront of what would later be known as the Yippies, and Abby Hoffman and some of these other, Jerry Rubin, and there would be this shift, in the counterculture towards the idea that this idea would spring up that what was really problematic was the idea that human beings as such were just so internally divided that unless you, like, metaphorically got your own house in order and self-actualized, the whole thing kind of shifted to the idea that, okay, going up against the military, going up against the military-industrial complex the way we've been has not been working. However, there was this idea that if we kind of internalized democratic values and got free of the policeman in our head through all these different kind of forms of self-actualization and self-awareness, that that ultimately the society would start to spontaneously change due to what have you, like good vibes, or like the Beach Boys song, good vibrations, if you were like putting and a lot of pseudoscientific wacky shit kind of came out of this whole thing, but at the same time, I mean, it was so this kind of shift back into like the internal landscape, into like kind of tinkering with oneself, would lead itself to, a lot of what I would call, once again, we would be in the, we would enter the era of the cult, enter the era of charismatic, pseudo-scientific, pseudo-religious, pseudo-mystical, communes and projects that would center around some kind of charismatic leader, and a lot of it was just not, if it wasn't just outright quackery and outright just fleecing people for cash, it was actually like very, very destructive to people's psyches. It's like, the whole methodology of like Fritz Perls, it's like this guy Fritz Perls, who starts this whole Esalen Institute, of like there's this whole move towards, I'm not there yet. So the whole idea of like changing the strategies and tactics to like working on yourself. You know, the personal ultimately became political. And Pearls was, and the idea of like getting to your primal rage, and these like, and you can see like these like sessions where, you know, like you've got 100 people laying on the floor all writhing around screaming, or people hitting stuff or expressing their anger and emotion, you know, and you know, it was what it was, really. But no one ever, you know, but it was all kind of like based on this liberation of feelings, this concentration on, and there was a selfishness to it inherently that they didn't, it was a blind spot that they really didn't account for, that this idea of, you know, that would later move into this, you know, the whole documentary is called Century of the Self. You know, by the 1970s, you know, what passes as the motto of the human being at that point is a kind of selfish, you know, neurotic person who is always kind of about themselves, you know, and who's, you know, political and whose political and economic identity is, you know, predicated on, you know, what have you done for me lately? What have you done? So this whole idea of collectivism, like, gradually kind of goes away, you know, and with it, so we're looking at a kind of spiritually bankrupt, like the very thing that all of this supposed mysticism and spirituality was supposed to engender became the very flip side of that, you know. And a lot of it had to do with this inherent kind of ethos of selfishness that embroidered itself throughout all these different communities, you know. But once again, you know, the problem stemmed from the fact, and it's like, and this still goes on, and like, this still goes on in all kinds of like things, from like the recovery industry to group therapy, you know, that there is still this kind of overarching structure of feeling that has to do with, you hear things like bandied around in like recovery communities, you know, whether it be recovery for drugs or whatever, like the idea that like AA is like a selfish program, you know, you need to take care of you first, you know, and it's and that your feelings are important, like this prominence that's put on your personal feelings about stuff. But within this whole kind of overarching like ethos, you know, one never ends up posing the question about, you know, it's like, your feelings are your feelings. You're entitled to your feelings. Your feelings should be recognized. Your feelings should be assuaged. You know, people should respect your feelings. But the question that still kind of sits at the bottom of this in our culture is you know, what I would contend is like, what if your feelings stem from a total misalignment with the truth? You know what? It's like, you know, that, you know, personally, it's like, it is my fervent belief that everything kind of thoughts, it's like, everything starts with thoughts. Everything kind of starts with whatever our conceptual system of the world is. And then, you know, all of our life of feeling kind of comes directly from that. You know, for instance, let's say, like, let's give an example. Like, you know, for instance, you might be in a relation, like you're in a romantic relationship, and your significant other goes and has an affair on you, all right, or does something of this nature, you know, and due to whatever conceptual system you have about what a relationship is and what monogamy is, and whatever thoughts you have about it's like the feelings, you know, whatever your thought. The foundational aspect of what your thoughts are on this thing, and what your thought processes generate in a given circumstance, you know, whether it come from religious upbringing or the idea of sin or whatever, well, kind of dictate the way that you feel about the situation. You know, it's like, you know, whereas, It's like, I think that, a lot of the primary work that pedagogy has to do is to understand the foundational nature of like our thought life, our life of thought, and how it kind of energizes, all of our other, both our volition, our will, and our feelings. It's like a lot of you might be undergoing depression right now, due to the pandemic and due to like feeling bored and feeling like things are pretty dark. But ultimately, all of this kind of stems from how I think about it, how I think about myself, how I think about the situations, and thoughts can be changed to more, we can change our life of thoughts. It's very, very hard to change our feelings, especially when they're out of control, so that, I don't want to overemphasize the idea of like the intellect, but I do feel that it is like a starting point for kind of rethinking human culture, so that we're not like, once again, it's like when we solely live in the life of feeling, when we solely live in our emotions, and a lot of us do, we make a lot of bad decisions. It's like we make a lot of bad decisions, predicated on our feeling life, as opposed to changing our thoughts about stuff. So I'm not gonna grandstand about that whole thing. If you want to read a really good book, though, about like a really great book of philosophy that talks about these kind of things. It's a book by a guy that I probably read more than any other intellectual, and his name is, I've talked about him in the other class before. His name is Rudolf Steiner. He was a thinker from the from the turn of the century to the mid-20s in Germany. And he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Freedom. The Philosophy of Freedom. And I would strongly, strongly recommend. It's a little bit difficult, but I would strongly, strongly recommend, if you want to get a handle on certain ideas going on in your own life, you might want to check out that book as a kind of starter's manual about how you can like start rethinking the idea of thought in your own life. So there's that. So there's this whole milieu of like people being programmable people. There's groups like Scientology that still, it's like, and once again, like groups like Scientology and EST and Esalen and Narconon. Narconon was, the like substance abuse treatment wing of Scientology, and had a lot to do. And a lot of these groups in the 70s were very, very violently, emotionally confronted. It was all about kind of confronting people in a kind of violent and a kind of psychological, like ripping people down. There was this whole kind of culture of ripping somebody, putting somebody on the hot seat. And this still occurs in like group therapy and drug treatment facilities and stuff like this. This kind of draconian idea of ripping somebody down, or ripping their preconceptions down, and forcing. It's like an intervention. A lot of this kind of social culture was predicated on this idea of these kind of like pushy interventions, that ultimately would be disastrous to the degree that they mess around with people's free will. They messed around with people's free will, and that, one thing that we find out on this like grand road of life is that you can't, and as an educator, I feel the same way. It's like, you can't force anybody. If you need to force somebody into being a certain way, it always has repercussions. You need to like you need to be able to frame your thoughts and actions in a way in which it doesn't impede the free will of other people. Anytime you start, and I think that ultimately, and I'll go as far as saying that ultimately, the takeaway of this entire course, could be reduced down to the idea that, when we start to, when our culture is predicated on a model of the human being that is coercible or needs to be coerced or needs to have his or her free will tinkered with in any way, ultimately leads to disaster. It ultimately leads to disaster. And all of these, and Scientology would become like, it's like there's a lot of good documentaries out there on Scientology, what it's about and all the different hypocrisies and the different nefarious things that L. Ron Hubbard, the founder, did, and how it continues to grow. On the West Coast, it's still very, very big. I don't really understand why. It's just they're that good. They're that good at fucking messing with people. Like all these stars or like all these celebrities from like Tom Cruise, all these other people were like people that you would have thought would have been like, more or less reasonable, functional human beings, like bought in to this total bullshit as a form of life, and they're the lesser for it. Bonjour, it's like rule of thumb. Bonjourno's tip for the day: don't get involved with a cult. All right, just don't. All right, especially, and I'm sure there will be like cults that will now spring up. There will be new cults. They come like they're pandemic. Cults are pandemic when it comes to all kinds of situations, end time scenarios, and whatever. It's like there was a series on HBO, like what was it called, like Taken or something like 25% of the human race just vanishes for no apparent reason. So all these kind of fundamentalists. I'm sure that the pandemic is going to breed a whole new generation of different cults and end time scenarios and all that. It's like just when they come to your door with their literature, it's just punch them in the fucking face and tell them to go. All right, you don't need to be controlled. You need to be free. So that's that. He talks about how these different forms of self-actualization that were being perpetrated by guys like Werner Erhard and Fritz Perls found their ways. They did social experiments, for instance, in a convent in which they wanted to liberate all the nuns, and they came in and they did this whole like repression therapy on the nuns, and ultimately the convent of the Immaculate Heart in California, it ultimately just dissolved. Everybody just decided to like just leave, and there was, so I mean, there's all this. There's all, and Werner Erhard, he's still alive, and Est is still a thing, and then, once again, and then, after all this kind of funkiness in the mid-70s, we come to this kind of actuarial, survey-related form of like consumer. The focus group kind of rears its ugly head once again. And once again, the focus group, the consumer focus groups, start to just kind of change up their game and change their rhetoric and change their euphemisms to the degree that they start basing their conceptions of self-actualization on this. Some of you psych majors might know it. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like the whole idea of like, what are our needs to be, a healthy, it's always like, somebody, every generation, a bunch of new people come up with like this model of what you need to do in order to be happy. And it usually involves, and it usually has a price tag involved in it. Usually involves you having to spend some money, to become enlightened or become and certainly this whole situation that gets fostered through the values and lifestyle movement. He talks about and the ways in which that whole value, all that stuff, like everything becomes like programmable. Like people fall into certain types, but the type, it's a tax, it's a way. All these mass surveys come out, and it becomes a way of categorizing people, like self starters or whatever. It's just total madness. In order to really and it's really just this thinly veiled version of consumer demographics, of kind of narrowing down and creating these new ways of getting money from people, but based on this idea of like, oh, you're actualizing yourself, you're expressing yourself by what you consume, whether you be, like a free thinker or like a conservative, that it's like self-expression and self-actualization really don't have to do with a communication of ideas or things as much as you express yourself through what you buy, or what you have, or what you want. It's like, in order to be, it's like how much of consumer advertising is still predicated on like targeting, your sense of like who you want to be, guys, like plagued with toxic masculinity will be like, like I gotta go get a Range Rover so I can be like the mountain man, or I gotta be, I gotta be a surfer, so I gotta go buy the best surfboard in order to, play out this persona, that usually is involved with accessorizing, self-actualization through accessorizing. So there's all that. We have our own. Somebody in the class is doing someone in the class is doing a paper on an episode of Black Mirror, that show Black Mirror called, I think it's called Nosedive, and tying it to like the Chinese social credit system that's springing up, and there's different variants of this going on. And I drew his attention to some links concerning the ways in which the Chinese social credit. If you don't know about that, we don't have a lot of time. It's like, just Google it. In fact, we're out of time. So, ultimately it's like, I would say that Century of the South, the first 3 episodes kind of, give us a very, very firm foundation on the different modalities of the ways in which this kind of shifting alliance between, the corporate world and big and government have of acting as means of control. Hopefully the course has been productive for you. Hopefully I've taken you through a mind walk. A mind walk. Hopefully I've taken you through a mind walk of different ideas that will lay the seeds for future endeavors. It's like having a toolbox to be, media literate and understand the way things operate. It's like knowledge is power, and knowledge is freedom too. It's like, it's the starting point. It's the starting point, And I believe that it's education of this type that is going to fuel the positive, once you see things for what they are, once you see the stuff for what it is, then you've got a toolbox. It becomes a question of what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it as a nation? And what are we going to do with it as a species? Because the clock's ticking. The clock is ticking, and, we can rebuild the world or we can watch it go down the tubes. It's a we program. It's up to us collectively. So I hope you have a good summer. You know, I'm going through a lot of what you're going through right now about the future, and it's like, I hope this has been productive. I hope it's been educational, and I hope you got your money's worth out of the course. I try to kind of bring my A game in, when it comes to like doing these classes, and I'm committed to them. And I have a sneaking suspicion that nobody's going to watch this video, but I would strongly suggest you do. You better watch it and you better comment on it. Have a good night, folks.